Hey there, welcome back to the Energy Blueprint podcast. This is Ari Witten, and today I have a very, very special guest, someone I've wanted to have on the podcast for a long time. He is a pioneer in the field of chronic fatigue syndrome, and he's been doing this for over 20 years. His name is Dr. Raymond Perrin, and he is a doctor of osteopathy, as well as a Ph.D., one of the very few Ph.D.s in the field of chronic fatigue syndrome specifically. He's also a researcher, and he's been doing research and treating people in this area for over 20 years, and really with some pioneering work and some pioneering theories in this field. So welcome, Dr. Perrin. It's such a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much, Ari. A pleasure to be on.
Yeah, so I would love if you could talk a little bit about your background, because it's so extensive. You know, I'm right now I have in front of me your CV, and you know, we were just talking before we started recording. I was like, how do I encapsulate all of this list of accomplishments? I mean, it's so impressive, everything you've done. So I would love if you could just highlight.
Well, thank you. Well, basically, I'm an osteopath, and I must correct you because there'll be some people watching this blog saying that you know, who are trying to find little nitpick at things. In England, a DO is not a doctor of osteopathy. It's a diploma of osteopathy, which is what I received. I received that after 4 years studying at the British School of Osteopathy, which is now the University College in London. And that's after a 4-year course. So this was, as an osteopath, osteopathic practitioners in America are more trained like MDs. They learn, and a lot of them don't actually use hands-on treatment at all.
Yeah, it's become very phased out.
Yeah. And in England, it's totally goes back to the roots of osteopathy, using our hands to diagnose and treat patients with all sorts of problems. Most people associate us. It's very similar in the States. You go to a chiropractor. It's similar to what you'd have in an osteopath in the UK. So it's very unusual for people to, when they see me and they say, well, what does he know about the body? You know, but osteopaths are trained for 4 years. But then afterwards I did 11 years post-grad studying for my doctorate in the field of chronic fatigue syndrome. And it all started in 1989. I was 5 years in practice, and then a cyclist came in to my practice. And I was very much involved in sports medicine. And I looked at his posture, looked at his spine, as we do. And we noticed there were certain problems, and I started treating those postural problems. He also told me he had chronic fatigue syndrome. Now, in the 1980s, it was known in the UK, and I think around the world, as the yuppie flu.
Yeah.
They used to say young, upward mobile people who just need to get out and do a bit more exercise. There's too much involved in the office. And this were the people that needed you know, just to do something else, and then and that's what they called it, yuppie flu. And unfortunately, I mean, I see patients with ME from age of 5. I think the youngest I've seen is 5, and the oldest I've seen is 85. And they can't really describe them as yuppies. So, you know, it does affect. That's when I started working with this patient, and I treated him. And are you okay there? You can stay.
Yes.
The thing is that when I treated his postural problems and his ME, he told me, we call it in England ME, myalgic encephalomyelitis. And he said, I've got ME. And I said, well, there's not much I can do for that, but I can treat your posture. And after a short while, his symptoms, after a few weeks, his symptoms started to ease off, not just his postural problems, but his chronic fatigue ME. And within a few months, he was symptom-free. And he was the one that started me on this long journey. And he said, you've got to find out what you've done, because you've got me better and nobody else has. It's just a coincidence. But then I was a bit inquisitive. I've always been inquisitive, and I wanted to find out what I have done. And that's when I started looking at other patients who had the symptoms to him. And I noticed there were physical signs in all these patients, especially in their spine. And that's what set me on this long road. And then I came up with my ideas and the hypothesis of what ME is. And then the rest is history. As I say, I'm 28 years on. I'm still doing it for helping people.
Remarkable, yeah, and that's it's fascinating to hear that story of kind of the origin of the discovery. I didn't know that, but that's very serendipitous that you kind of discovered it accidentally almost.
Yeah.
So let's get right into kind of the meat of your theory and talk about, in your opinion, what is basically the cause of chronic fatigue syndrome or myalgic encephalomyelitis?
Well, as I said, once I started looking at other patients, I noticed there were spinal problems. But then as a physician, there's a wonderful American doctor, Abram Verkouji. You heard of Abram Verkouji? He's the professor at Stanford University. And during one of the wonderful conferences I've attended in the US on chronic fatigue syndrome, it was one of the CFS conferences in Stanford, and San Francisco. And Professor Verkouji said something very, very poignant. And I quote this all the time now. He said, "The doctor's round has become square." He said, the doctor doesn't nowadays look at the patient, examine the patient physically and examine and feel them. They usually just look in the screen.
Yeah.
And they look at what tests they can do and what their scan shows, but they don't actually look at the person and feel the person. And I, as an osteopath, do. And this is what we do. And I started looking for more and more signs that these patients all shared. And then I published a paper in '93 showing that there's possibly a biomechanical cause of the whole problem. I then went further and we did studies at Salford University in the UK, where we actually where I put down my theories, and then this was eventually put into the Ph.D. And basically, it's this. ME, I believe, or CFS ME, however you want to call it, there's different names. And now in America, they call it SEID, the new name for it, systemic exertion intolerance disease, which I'm not very keen on. I mean, there's so many different names, and that's the problem with ME as well. But basically, it's a buildup of toxins, mostly inflammatory toxins, in the spine and the brain, in the central nervous system. And this causes an irritation of the brain, but mainly in the autonomic nervous system, in the nervous system that controls the functions of the body, the automatic functions of the body. And one of the main areas is in the brainstem and around the hypothalamus, which the hypothalamus is one of the main control areas of most of what we do of what goes on in our body. And this buildup of toxins, and it can be other things besides. I mean, the one thing I talk about in my thesis is cytokines, which are pro-inflammatory toxins that come from infections or inflammation. And then you've got environmental pollutants, and then you've got trauma that can lead to more buildup of the different inflammatory toxins in the brain. And then one of the most important causes of neurotoxicity is stress. And all this builds up. And what happens is it should drain away through channels that enter the lymphatic system. Now, when I said this, going back 20 odd years ago, came up with this theory, it was completely against medical thought at the time, completely. The lymphatic system is a system of drainage. It's a secondary system. And one of the things it's been known for 400 years, since a wonderful Italian called Aselli discovered it. And since then, everybody has actually accepted one fact, and it's been proved wrong. And the fact is that the brain and the spinal cord, the central nervous system, does not have a need for lymphatic drainage and doesn't have one. And why does it not need one in the first place? Because the lymph is there for the larger molecules. Small molecules go through very small, like a filtration system, and small molecules enter the blood through capillaries in their walls, but larger molecules can't get in. And that's why we need the lymphatic system, because their capillaries are like, their walls are like gills of a fish, I always explain. and they open and close and allow large molecules in. The brain doesn't need the lymphatic system because large molecules officially can't get into the brain because we have a barrier,
right?
The blood-brain barrier. And that stops, it's got very tight junctions and only very small molecules like water. If you look at the measurement of water molecule, it's like 18 Daltons large. Dalton is the measurement of a molecule. And something really large, like for instance, can't get in. Now, this is so wrong on all counts, but nobody actually thought about it till recently. But how do I know it's wrong? Is because we now know exactly how the hormonal system in the body works. The hormonal system is a system of it's chemicals, large protein molecules that don't swim around the blood, but they go around the blood, and they cause lots of things to happen. And their control is through the main center of the hormonal control is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus measures hormones, and it, by a mechanism called biofeedback, sends messages to change the hormonal level. Let's give an example. Insulin. Insulin is produced in the pancreas. This pancreas produces insulin to control sugar levels. We all know about insulin. And men and women all have insulin. Insulin enters the brain, and there's receptors on the hypothalamus that measure the insulin. Now, when I first said this, I was giving a workshop in New York. A very eminent doctor, who was an osteopathic physician, said, "Ray, we love your work, but it's absolutely nonsense." Insulin entering the brain? Absolute. How can it? You know how big it is? You know, water molecule, 18 Daltons goes through the blood-brain barrier. Insulin's 5,808 Daltons large. There's no way it can get through the blood-brain barrier, but it does. Insulin receptors on the brain, we know this in the hypothalamus, and that's how it controls, that's how the hypothalamus controls all hormones, by biofeedback. And we know this for sure. So how does it get through? Because we now know the blood-brain barrier has got lots of gaps, and it's not such a good barrier after all. And therefore, besides hormones entering, and this is a very big clue in why women get ME much more than men. The hormones, there's much more involvement with the hormones and the hypothalamus in women than men, and there's lots of fluctuations, but lots of toxins that enter the brain as well. And this is what the problem is. Once we know that definitely toxins and definitely large molecules entering the brain, how did it get out? It's a one-way system. This drain, this system of going into the brain, it doesn't go out that way. It's got to have a lymphatic drainage, and we don't officially have one in the brain and spinal cord.
You know, if I can just interject one point for emphasis here, because I think it's so important that people get this. I've seen a video of you talking about lymphatic drainage in the brain from 2005, I believe. 12 years ago, and it sounds like you've been talking about it even longer than that, maybe close to 20 years or more than 20 years. Now, I will point out for people listening, as of 2017, just this year, I think about 6 months ago, something like that.
Yeah, well, it was actually the paper that you're talking about came out in October.
Okay.
The NIH paper, yeah?
Yes, and this was a huge, amazing piece of research that came out in the United States. It was published all over in major media outlets, I would imagine all over the world, really in mainstream news. And it's rare that a scientific discovery kind of makes it all the way to mainstream headlines. And what was this big discovery that just happened in 2017? It's that the brain has lymphatic vessels and has lymphatic drainage, which, again, you know, this is being hailed in 2017 as this amazing new discovery. You've been talking about this for over 20 years. Yeah.
And I've been treating it for over 20 years. One of the things they said in that article, the NIH, was this could lead to understanding the neuroimmune disorders and so many neurological disorders when we now know it actually exists. and they were saying, but we don't know how many diseases it affects, and we also don't know how to treat it. Well, I've been treating it for 28 years. Mm-hmm. And my paper on this drainage of the brain, which we'll come to soon, was published in the American Journal, the Journal of the Osteopathic Association of America, in 2007. So in June 2007 that I published a paper. It was headline in this paper, in this journal, which is to the Osteopathic Physicians of America, and it's there on the front page, and they have a whole picture of the lymphatic drainage affecting a chronic fatigue syndrome. So we've known about this, but we've never had absolute proof, and that's the trouble. I've been treating this, but there's not been there's not been any evidence to show this, because it's very, very hard to scan this area. But what we believed, in the brain, there are passages, there are gaps next to blood vessels, and these are called perivascular spaces, also called Virchow-Robin spaces. Now, these perivascular spaces, it's theorized by other neuroscientists over the years. There's been Southampton University, where they've done a lot of work there. And there's also been work in the States by different scientists and Russia looking at this drainage system. But there's always been theory. They realized that there must be a drainage, but nobody's actually been able to show where it is and exactly how it works. So then the big breakthrough came. Roy Weller was the professor at Southampton, and he published a paper showing that if you injected into the brain of rats, what he injected in the brain ended up in the lymph nodes of the neck. So there was a connection, but we couldn't prove that it was just through these spaces. And then in 2012, in Rochester University, Jeff Iliff and his colleagues in Rochester, in New York, showed that the drainage did exist in mice. Proved it. And he showed that this space actually filled up the perivascular space. And the most interesting thing is, when it stopped working, they produced genetic modified mice that actually didn't have this drainage system. There was a buildup of the fluid around the hypothalamus, around the thalamus, and around the basal ganglia, which explains so much of the symptoms of ME. The basal ganglia, for those who don't know the neuroscience behind it, the basal ganglia have lots of different functions. One of the main functions of basal ganglia is pain suppression. They produce a chemical called GABA. And GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid, actually suppresses pain. So if that gets affected, this causes more centralized pain. And that's what people with fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome have, pain. And then you've also got the basal ganglia, also as part of the limbic system. And I know you've had Ashok Gupta on talking about his amygdala, and amygdala is part of the basal ganglia. Yes. So if the drainage doesn't work, it's going to affect the amygdala function. I mean, Ashok deals very much with the limbic system, but it's much more than that. Once the toxins stop draining, it will affect the whole brain. But these are the areas that they've found, first of all. And there's also the limbic system is the emotional side, which affects the thalamus and the hypothalamus and the basal ganglia. They're all going to be affected big time. And also sleep is going to be affected. And so there's sleep centers there. And one of the main things is that the basal ganglia are like the junction box between all the frontal areas of the brain, the thinking part, and all the doing part of the back of the brain. And tracks go through those from one area to the other. And this means that if you get this affected, because toxic buildup in this area, you end up with everything becoming more of an effort. Everything becomes walking, talking, reading, everything becomes more laborious. And this is what chronic fatigue syndrome patients feel. Everything becomes more of a chore. That explains that part. And then in 2013, I got in touch with Jeff Iliff straight away, and they said that they're looking at amyloid, beta amyloid, which was being implicated in Alzheimer's, because that's one of the things that was looking at as Alzheimer's caused by the same problem, and many of us believe it is. So, and it's interesting, the early symptoms of Alzheimer's are very similar to the symptoms of chronic fatigue syndrome. So the thing is that there's that going on. And then also, so they started looking at what happens to these mice when they sleep. That was amazing, because in my original hypothesis, I drew a picture. It's in my book, it's in my thesis, and this picture shows the hypothalamus and a little organ in the brainstem called the locus coeruleus. Now, the locus coeruleus produces a chemical called noradrenaline, and it produces a blue hue on the brain. If you actually do a dissection of the brain, that this area is actually slightly bluish, because noradrenaline, or in America they call it norepinephrine, is slightly bluish. And this noradrenaline, or norepinephrine, I'll use the American term for you, this is like epinephrine. It's like adrenaline, epinephrine. It causes you to be wired and fired. And I said, many years ago, I drew a diagram in 2013, 2014, 2004, I drew this diagram. That then was in my thesis. And this diagram showed that the drainage of the brain showed two organs, the hypothalamus and locus coeruleus. And what Iliffe and his team in Rochester discovered, and there's a paper by, I think it's under the principal author was Z, I.E. et al. It's the same group in Rochester. And they showed that this drainage system occurs mostly during delta wave sleep. In delta wave sleep, the hypothalamus and locus coeruleus axis switched off. And this went round the world as well. We now know why we sleep, because the brain needs to drain toxins out of the brain and spinal cord, and it does it during this delta wave sleep, the good restorative sleep that ME patients don't get.
Wow.
Very, very little delta wave sleep. They have alpha wave, and alpha wave sleep makes you feel wired and fired, because the hypothalamus locus coeruleus axis switches on, and you don't get deep restorative sleep. You feel wired and fired. And most patients with chronic fatigue ME, because the hypothalamus locus coeruleus axis doesn't switch off, it's firing off all the time, and it's not draining the toxins away, they're wired and fired at night. They can't get to sleep.
Now, what's the origin? Kind of the first point of dysfunction there is it?
So, well, it's the poisons building up in the hypothalamus, and that's due to the fact, because then we'll come a bit further. Sorry, I've missed out one salient point, and this comes to the whole vicious circle that causes ME. So this has now been shown to actually be the case, that this is what the hypothalamus locus coeruleus axis did. But the hypothalamus and the brainstem is very involved in the sympathetic nervous system control, or the autonomics. And the main part of the autonomics, a major part, is the sympathetic nerves that come out from the spine in the upper thoracic, in the thoracic spine, and fire off to all over the body. And one of the areas it controls is the thoracic duct. And this is the main duct of the lymphatic system. Now we know sympathetic control. There's smooth muscle walls on the lymphatics all over the lymphatics, and they're all controlled by sympathetic nerves. But the main duct of the thoracic duct pumps at a rate of around 4 beats a minute into the bloodstream. Now, when I studied physiology in the 1980s, this was not taught. We were taught there's no pump of the lymph. It's just pressure from outside influences, from the blood and from breathing and from muscles, but there's no actual pump.
Right.
For years we've known that there is a pump. So older doctors would have not learned that. So there's still some old doctors there.
Yeah, I didn't learn it. I learned that lymph drainage is purely a function of muscle movement and the diaphragm and so on.
So this is, now we know 100% there's this pumping mechanism. The work of John Kinmonth, who was a surgeon in London, he wrote books on this, and he could never prove this pumping mechanism existed. But what happened is, he said that in disease states, the pumping mechanism, because sympathetic nerves go wrong, it causes a backflow. And this is so salient to my whole theory. And it involves why we can see certain signs of ME. It causes a backflow of lymphatics. So instead of pumping out, they've got valves that allow one directional flow. it pumps the wrong way. So that so what you have is a beaded a vessel that Kimmett called varicose lymphatics, and the vessels become very enlarged, so they become varicose megalymphatics. And he tried to prove their existence, but every time he did a scan, all his colleagues said, "Very nice scan, John, but it's just a varicose vein," because it was just white on a black background.
Right.
And then in my book and my thesis, and I think in my lecture, I actually showed a photo of the varicose lymphatics, where you could see, was one patient came in and you could actually see it on the surface of his chest, that the thoracic duct goes to the left subclavian vein, and this was pushing back, and you have drainage in the right side as well. And the backflow caused, actually, you could see it on the surface of the skin. And this showed varicose vessels that were showing a backflow of lymph, but there was no color. Mm-hmm. There was no blood, because the varicose veins would be bluish or purplish.
Right.
These were colorless, because lymph has a colorless fluid in it. The lymphatic fluid is colorless. So these were the first photos, and it was published in my journal paper. It's also in my book, the first photos ever of varicose lymph. And
I saw them.
We can't see these in most ME patients and chronic fatigue syndrome patients or fibromyalgia patients, but we can feel them. Everybody with this is one of the physical signs that we've just researched, and you can actually feel the varicose lymph just under the surface, especially in the chest, because that's the first port of call where there's a backflow. And this is the second reason why women get ME much more than men, because their breast tissue is much more engorged than men, because they've got much more enhanced breast tissue.
Fascinating. So I think probably everything you just went over might be a lot to...
There's a lot to take in, but basically, in a nutshell, there's a backflow. This backflow of lymph goes back into the brain. So this drainage system that we now know exists, that you said, we've now got proof of it from the papers on 2013. 2015, they showed more studies showing that there was actually lymph drainage in the meninges, in the membranes of the brain, actually showed proper lymph vessels. And that was the work done in Virginia University by Johnny Kipnis and his team, and also shown by Aspen Lund in Finland, I believe. And then that was 2015, and now that was all animal studies. So all my people who want to sort of criticize my work can say, well, it's in animals, not in humans. Mm-hmm. Now we have in the NIH study that involved the teams from Virginia and Rochester, I believe, they showed the drainage in humans, and it actually is there. Now, this drainage is a two-way thing. It goes back and forward. So the toxins could actually drain back into the brain. So when the sympathetic nervous system, which is due to the hypothalamus going wrong, if that starts pumping the wrong way, this wrong passage can go right back into the brain, producing more toxicity in the brain. A vicious circle ensues, leading to what we call chronic fatigue syndrome.
Beautiful description. So, since there's so many moving pieces that you just outlined, I would love if we could recap all of these different steps of this vicious circle in a kind of summarized, simple way for people to really get this concept.
Right. So very simply, I have it's in my book, but there's diagrams, but very simply, the brain and the spine should drain toxins away, because this drainage is not just the scans that have shown all the proof and all the evidence have shown that the brain drains, but it's also in the spine. That's not been looked at yet. Hopefully there'll be somebody looking at this and saying, well, yeah, let's do some MR scanning on the spine as well and see this. But the spine and the brain can be affected genetically. It can follow from parental, it can be familial, but it could be from trauma to the head or trauma to the spine, or doing too much. Most chronic fatigue syndrome patients do too much when they're younger and their spine develops wrongly. They're very active, usually very younger. And this spinal problems that we see, this has been again shown to be correct. I hypothesized this in '93, And it's now been proven by work done by Johns Hopkins University. Professor Peter Rowe is a very eminent specialist in chronic fatigue syndrome there, and he's done the work that shows that the spine, the thoracic spine, is affected. So once you've got a problem in the spine and you've got a problem in the head from maybe a trauma or maybe the way you've developed and where this drainage, and the drainage, and this is very important, Ari, the drainage is in this area, mainly in this area called the cribriform plate, which is behind where my fingers are pointing now. There's also drainage behind the eyes, the trigeminal nerves in the cheeks, and the ears. They're the main drainage of the cranium, and they're the main areas that get congested, or there's a backflow in this area. And you'll find most ME patients and chronic fatigue syndrome, ME, fibromyalgia, get a lot of pain behind the eyes, behind this area, in the ears. They have problems in the blur. They have photophobia. The eyes are very sensitive to light. Their ears are very sensitive to sound. All this is because of toxins building up. And once the toxins build up, they then start the vicious circle going. The hypothalamus then sends wrong messages to the sympathetic nervous system around the body, which then causes the main duct of the lymph to pump in the wrong direction. And when it pumps in the wrong direction, more toxins are getting built up in this drainage point, in the spine and in the brain. So you get more and more inflammatory toxins from infections, or from stress, or from injury, or from pollution. Pollution is a massive amount of toxicity. There's 80,000 known toxins in the environment. And there's a lot of environmental doctors, including Sarah Myalgic, she was originally an environmental doctor, who have seen that there's lots of pollutants affecting the body. Mm-hmm. And then there's also familial. It can be genetics as well. Mm-hmm. And then you have this buildup of toxins, and then the whole system spirals out of control. The sympathetic nervous system goes wrong. The main duct of the lymph goes worse, which causes more and more toxic buildup, eventually leading to me.
Beautiful. So thank you for summarizing that. And I hope
that makes some sense to you.
It does, yes. And it's also cyclical. I want to point out to everybody listening that this is kind of a vicious circle where toxins may be an initial trigger for some of this initial brain dysfunction and buildup of toxins in the brain. And then as a result of that, that may disrupt the HPA axis and kind of the regulation of
the whole metabolism.
Right.
And that's why you see so many metabolic problems in chronic fatigue syndrome. And the one cruel part, and this is one other thing I say, ME is not, chronic fatigue syndrome, ME, fibromyalgia aren't the worst illnesses in the world, but they're the cruelest, because they usually hit people who are very, very, who have got a lot of, willpower to get better. Willpower can help people, even with cancer, have been shown. And how does that work is because the sympathetic nervous system in these patients stimulates the immune system to work better. But if it's that system going wrong, the more you try and say, I'm going to beat this, the worse you get.
Yeah.
This is how cruel it is, because the more a person tries to get better, the worse they usually get. And they have to back off. And nobody wants to accept the disease, but they mustn't try and fight it. You've got to try and work out how to combat it in a very gradual way. And that's what we do. Yeah.
Gotcha. So there's a number of things I want to digress into, a few comments and a couple questions. I think there's some interesting connections. One is, in the modern world, we have this trend towards less and less sleep. There's a progressive change over the last 50 years or so where people are getting an hour or two less sleep than we did just a few generations ago. We also have chronically disrupted circadian rhythm as a result of not enough time outdoors, too much artificial light at night in conjunction with that. And now that we know that one of the critical roles of this lymph system function, especially at night while we sleep, is to cleanse toxins from the brain. I think there is a clear link there as well as to how disrupted circadian rhythm and sleep deprivation tie into this vicious circle.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's interesting that there's the hypothalamus in that case, that everybody's talked about hypothalamus pineal gland link, the melatonin link, which is important, but it's the hypothalamus locus coeruleus axis, which is even more important.
Interesting.
And that's the thing, is you've got to have that axis in the brain working to allow this drainage to occur. And that means delta wave. And Stanford University have shown, there's a wonderful couple, Marcy and Mark Zinn at Stanford, who've done a lot of work on this field. And they've shown that most ME patients get delta wave during the day.
Wow.
And they get most of the delta wave, so the toxins come out during the day and they feel tired during the day. At nighttime, they said they're wired and fired. But one of the interesting things about sleep is that what they found, the scientists that eventually discovered drainage of the brain working in the animals in Rochester, they found that lying the animals on the side helps the drainage more.
Interesting. Does one side matter over the other?
I don't think this was a one side matters. You all say lie on your left side because it's meant to be healthier. But lie on your side is good for your spine. Mm-hmm. They've not gone further with this, that there's a whole drainage of perivascular spaces down the spine as well. And that's why lying on the side probably helps, because it helps the spine drain off the toxins as well. Mm-hmm. It's not so much the brain that is draining more, it's the spine that's draining more. So we tell all our patients, lie on your side, cushion between your knees, and that's good for the spine, and that helps the drainage as well. Simple as that. And that's one of the very important things about sleeping. But you're right, the whole rhythm can change, and that's why shift workers get a lot of illnesses, because they're circadian rhythms. And it's very important to get that rhythm right again. There are tricks of the trade. There are bits of advice I can give your listeners about what to do about sleep.
Yeah, by all means.
Blue light filters are so important all through the day. And then at night, no screens at all. So nobody with chronic fatigue syndrome ME should be watching this last thing before they go to bed, because it's bad for all. They should have so no screens at all. And then if you use screens, use a blue light filter. You can get glasses, they're orange or yellow glasses that you can wear. They're better than the screen filters, but you need some filter, because blue light stimulates alpha waves, and we don't want alpha waves at night. There's work done that shows Chuck Lapp, who's another very, very eminent doctor in America on ME, who's done a lot of work on sleep. He showed that there's a lot of alpha waves in ME patients at night time, which we now know that is so. And any blue light will stimulate more alpha waves. So you avoid any screens for an hour before bed. And when you use screens, any television, computer, mobile phones, anything, always use a filter. That's something. And then there's also sleep hygiene, good sleep hygiene, in getting, first of all, a good comfortable bed, and making sure there's nothing interrupting you. Make sure you have a real darkened room, and all these things help.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, I go through a whole system of about a dozen circadian rhythm habits and then 17 different sleep hygiene habits. And I see so many people that improve dramatically, literally within 10 days, 14 days of just applying that. And now that, beyond just the circadian rhythm regulation of hormones and metabolic functions, it now makes more sense to me why so many people can improve dramatically from that, just based on allowing toxins to cleanse from the brain a little more efficiently.
Yeah.
So another area, I guess a quick question on the subject of enhancing lymph drainage. One of the things people talk about is like jumping on a trampoline, or even doing vibrational therapies. I'm curious if you think those have any value.
When I first realized that lymph was involved, and it was interesting how I got involved in that, because I had a patient who had lymph engorgements in the breast tissue, as we see now all the time. And when we actually did work on the lymphatics, and it's direct work on draining off the toxins, the treatment we do is, I call it the concertina effect. So you push down and you push up, back and front, and you drain off all the pressure goes into this area, which is then forces the drainage to occur into the bloodstream. And when we did that, she had palpitations, she had problems in breathing, and which is very common in very severe ME patients, and these all went very quickly. And what we realized that with the drain, oh gosh, I've forgotten the question now.
just about trampolines and vibration plates.
So what I realized then is that when I first started involving lymphatics, there's lots of different techniques for lymphatic drainage, trampolining and doing the vibration and all those. And there's techniques that are taught, thoracic duct pump, thoracic pump techniques, abdominal pump techniques. There's standard, there's VODA techniques. There's a lot of different standard techniques for lymph drainage that I tried on patients and was failing. Patients were getting worse and worse and worse. And I couldn't understand what it was. And then I realized with the discovery of these varicose lymph and discovery that there's this backflow, when you stimulate the lymph to work more in the wrong direction, you're making the symptoms worse. So the standard lymph drainage techniques that help sluggish lymph will make an ME patient worse.
Interesting.
So they mustn't do that. When they're on the mend and we've got this reversal sorted out and everything's pumping the right way, because that's how it works. When we've got the drainage working and the cranial, this is where it comes into the cranial rhythm, which we can talk about maybe now, or shall I talk about the cranial rhythm now?
Sure.
Right. In the paper I published in the Journal of the American Osteopathic Association 2007 was on the cranial rhythm. Now the cranial rhythmic impulse is a rhythm that is very much an osteopathic term. But a lot of manual therapists now do cranial courses or cranial sacral courses, up ledger courses, Sutherland courses. And these are about the drainage on stimulating the cranial rhythm. But what is the cranial rhythm? And the cranial rhythm is so important part of my whole treatment. And for years and years, I was using cranial techniques without really knowing what I was doing. I knew I was stimulating some rhythm, but I didn't know what that rhythm was. It was around 8 to 12 beats a minute, but what was causing it? With my research, I discovered, and this was fundamental in the whole of osteopathic philosophy. In the brain, cerebrospinal fluid is produced by the blood. It's produced by an area called the choroid plexus. It's produced by the blood, goes around the brain and goes out the blood again. It starts at 50 to 100 beats a minute. It then goes around the brain and comes out as 50 to 100 beats a minute, the cardiac rhythm. So in the brain itself, we know that is 50 to 100 beats a minute. When we do MR scanning, and I've done quite a lot in research, when we look at the cerebrospinal fluid in the brain, it moves at a rate of 50 to 100 beats a minute. But some of it now drains off through these passages. And this goes into the thoracic duct that, due to the wonderful work of John Kinmonth I mentioned earlier, beats at a slow rhythm of around 4 beats a minute. Where you have two waves coming together, physics dictates a phenomenon called interference. You have an interference wave. And you don't need to be a physicist for this. You just have to be into a beach. And you see a big wave coming in, small wave going out, they crash together, produce a third wave. And in the body, the third wave is produced by the cranial flow from the brain, which starts at 50 to 100 beats a minute, into the lymphatics, producing a third wave. And that third wave, osteopaths call the cranial rhythmic impulse. And that is dysfunctional in all ME patients. And it's because it's just not draining properly. There's a disturbance in the flow. And this disturbance in the flow causes the rhythm to change, and we can feel this. And this is one of the physical signs of ME. And so this whole drainage system is working the wrong way. And if you just stimulate the lymph to work better, it will work more in the wrong way. but we need to get it working the right way first. And once you've drained the toxins off using cranial techniques, once you've got the lymph drainage techniques working, the spine working better, all the drainage will occur, hopefully naturally and healthily. All the toxins will drain away from the brain, and bit by bit, the brain will start functioning again, and the symptoms will ease off. And that's how it works. So, but if you do the standard lymph drainage techniques, pumping and vibration, you can stimulate this drainage to work more in the wrong direction, causing more toxicity. So yeah, you have to get the drainage working right. And that gives an idea of what the actual reason for the whole treatment and why it's done the way we do it.
Gotcha. So one question, you know, the initial story of your discovery, you talked about this cyclist that you worked with and addressing the postural issues, and how he was fixed in a relatively short period of time. Now it seems, as I'm listening to you talk, it seems like you're emphasizing more the lymph drainage techniques and less of the spinal deformities and addressing the postural aspects of things.
The postural aspects are important because they help the drainage. And as Peter Rowe has discovered in Johns Hopkins University, there's a lot of spinal problems in the thoracic area. And he's found the same problems that I have. There's usually a flattened area in the mid part, and there's what we call lordosis in the mid part of the thoracic duct, and sometimes kyphosis above and below. This is very, very common, and it can be seen in most ME patients. You see this pattern, but there's always a disturbance of this area, and so there's a lot of problems that we can actually physically see with ME, and these are the signs that we just finished a research project that has been published just now in November 2017 in the British Medical Journal Open Access. So it's BMJ Open, so everybody can read it, which is nice.
Yeah, I looked at it, and we'll put a link in the show notes for this page to make sure people will get it.
Yeah. So there's the 5 physical signs that we see in all ME patients that are, now we've done the study, it shows a link to this physical, or what I'm saying, that there's actually physical signs. And this, the BMJ said this offers a proof of concept for these signs, because we showed 86% of patients were correctly diagnosed just using physical signs, no symptoms, no history. The NHS consultant only managed to diagnose 44% of the CFS ME patients correctly.
Is it based on using their medical history? And
no, not using. He wasn't allowed to learn medical history either, but using neurological signs, reflexes, do a normal neurological examination, a normal rheumatological examination, watching muscle power, pain, and then watching how the patients move. Could he actually see they were ill? And this is a big problem. A lot of CFS ME patients don't look ill. You didn't know they were ill. And this study showed it, because he only got 44% of the ME patients actually diagnosed correctly. 56%, he said, were healthy. And we showed 86% of patients were diagnosed just with physical signs. Now, in clinic, we go through a history, we go through symptoms, and we have these physical signs to show. And these physical signs don't just help us diagnose almost 100%. They also are very important in severity. So the more severe the physical signs, usually the worse the illness is. And sometimes I can see patients are trying to be healthier than they are, and the body's telling me it's not. So the physical signs are real, and they're in my book. But basically, there's tender points in the chest and the abdomen, and there's spinal problems and the cranial flow problem, and these varicose lymphatics are all signs of neurolymphatic damage of the brain and the sympathetic and the autonomic nervous system, and the lymphatics not working the way they should do. And this is the whole of my thesis.
Excellent. So what about the spinal deformity aspect of it? Do you see spinal deformities reliably and hyperkyphosis in the thoracic spine?
Well, this was the first thing I saw. That's the first thing I saw, is that the pattern I saw, and I published a paper in the British Osteopathic Journal in '93, showing that there's a physical problem in the spine. It was more observational. It wasn't it wasn't a scientific treatise that I'm so proud of. It
Sure.
was observational. Peter Rowe later admitted, he saw me at a conference and he said, you know, we've been following ever since that 93 paper came out. And I said, oh, you didn't look at that paper, did you? I was a bit embarrassed. But it was more observational. It showed that what I was seeing, there wasn't as much scientific rigor as it should, you know, but it was
Right.
showing what I noticed with patients. And they're all ME patients. I've never seen an ME patient yet that doesn't have a thoracic spine problem.
Interesting. You know, the reason I bring that up is my brother is actually a chiropractor and specifically a posture specialist. He doesn't specialize in chronic fatigue syndrome or fibromyalgia specifically, but he's had a number, maybe close to 10 patients over the last decade who have had either fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue syndrome. And he's been able to achieve remarkable improvements of symptoms just by treating posture.
Yeah, and that's, you can, but the lymphatics are what we're trying to do all the time. I'm trying to get more and more severe patients better, and the very severe patients, there's very little that can be done for them. But if they can be touched, if you can't touch a patient, there's nothing which I can't help them. And there's some patients who are with severe fibromyalgia who are so severe you can't actually touch them. And it's a very shame. We can do some cranial sometimes on them, but very little else. But the ones that are very severe, bedridden, housebound, with working on the spine, it helps. But with working on the spine and lymphatics and doing the whole technique that I've taught now for many years, we get patients from bedridden to sitting, to standing, to walking, to back to normal life. And the Sky News recorded interviews with 2 of my patients who were such like that, who were bedridden, housebound. And so with fibromyalgia and ME, you can treat the posture and improve it. You can treat lots of things and improve it. There's diet, there's nutrition, there's looking at the mitochondria as Dr. Sarah Myhill does. All these things are going to help the jigsaw, but you've got to get the neurolymphatic system working better to go to the root of what I believe is causing the problem. And then it can recover fully, not just improve, but fully. And it's not easy. And I don't have, there's always people out there who might have had my treatment and it's not helped, but we can't help everybody, we try.
Right. So I'm glad you mentioned what you did in the last few sentences there, because that was actually my next question. I was going to ask you how you feel your work ties into, Ashok Gupta has his own theories that revolve around amygdala and limbic system dysfunction, and kind of for him, the main thing that's going on is psychological stress, emotional stress or trauma and things of that nature. We also have Sarah Myhill and Robert Naviaux, who've done a lot of work around the mitochondria. How do you feel your work ties in with?
Well, it ties in totally with them. And there's a lot of work by Professor Julian Newton in the UK that's looked at the autonomic nervous system, looked at lactic acid buildup in the muscles, which again, if the lymphatics aren't draining the lactic acid out, you're going to get buildup of lactic acid big time, and that's what they've discovered.
And that, by the way, that explains post-exertional fatigue.
Exactly. Yeah. And this is all related to autonomic dysfunction that has now been proven by the work by Newcastle University in the UK. And Ashok Gupta, his work on his personal experiences of the limbic system, because he came through it through having the illness himself. And Ashok's work is very interesting because it does help if you reduce one of the biggest causes of neurotoxins is stress. So any treatment at all that reduces stress is going to help, but it's not going to cure. Now, if the main reason for the toxicity is stress, then it might get the person back to normal life and living fine. But it's just one of the parts. It's not just stress, it's physical. There's physical damage sometimes with patients, and some patients there's not had too much emotional stress. It's more viral stress, bacterial stress, environmental stress, and those are things that need to be related. What Sarah Myhill does is treat the result of this stress. Now, I know she believes it's all in the mitochondria. that if the mitochondria go wrong and it's a mitochondrial disease and it causes all the rest of the things to happen. But really, I believe what she's doing is treating when the metabolic system, and Robert Navier as well with a metabolic test that he's done, when the autonomic nervous system, the control mechanism that balances the whole metabolic rate, goes wrong, then every single blood test you have will start showing different things going wrong. And the more and more they look, the more and more they'll find wrong.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to be the answer.
Right. Yeah. I mean, in Navio's metabolomics study, they found, I mean, they measured over 600 different metabolic markers, and something like 80% were downregulated. So, I mean, there's widespread.
That was a San Diego study, I believe, but there's been
Yes.
another study at Stanford that showed different metabolic. and it's interesting, the cytokine profile has been done a lot when they first discovered it, there was I think 7, and there's 12 now, there's 17, I think, cytokines. And there's going to be more and more as they find. It's actually very interesting. One of the cytokines that they found is leptin, which is a female hormone that affects satiety, hunger, and loss of appetite, and increased weight and decreased weight. Leptin's very involved in that. And Jared Younger did discover that the levels, Professor Jared Younger discovered that levels of leptin went up as the symptoms went worse with chronic fatigue syndrome, ME, and then went down. And it's very related. This is one of the cytokines that's very much related, and it affects the glial cells of the brain, these glial cells, the astrocytes and the glial cells of the brain. And this is where these toxins stay. And it's the drainage of the brain that the Americans call the lymphatic system, draining the glial cells. So the toxins build up there. And this is all what's happening with the central drainage problem that leads to all these other metabolic problems and pathways. And this is what's happening. So there are ways of treating the results of that. But what I've tried to do over the years I've been working, of this almost 3 decades I've been working in this field, is to look at what's the root. And the root is not going to be treated by a drug. And that's the problem.
Well, there seems to be agreement on that it's not going to, the root is not going to be treated by a drug. It's, people might say it's the limbic system is the root and emotional stress is the root. And so address that, and that's where all the different, I mean, I talked to Ashok about this, and he was saying, well, I think that it's limbic dysfunction at the core from stress, and then that then causes a cascade of other physiological dysfunction. And Navio and Myhill would say it starts at the mitochondria and cascades into different kinds of dysfunction.
And that could be the case in some cases, but what starts it? See, the question is, and this is the one question I asked years ago, when it used to be called post-viral fatigue, it's not the virus, it's the post-virus. It's the buildup of these cytokines or prostaglandins or other inflammatory toxins after the virus has hit that needs to be drained away. And these are large molecules. It's large molecules. It's always the large molecules. What in nutrition, you look at nutrition, what affects ME patients? What causes the gut dysbiosis and the leaky gut and everything? It's the large molecules, the protein molecules like casein in milk, gluten, candida, yeast. All these are major toxins because there's a massive amount of lymphatics in the abdomen. And they're not draining these large molecules are not drained away. They're leaking through in the gut. And it's very interesting that the histology of the gut is very similar to the histology of the brain. So the blood-brain barrier has a very much links to the blood-gut barrier. And this drainage occurs badly in this area as well. And it needs the lymphatics to drain it away. So this is another clue to the fact that it's a lymphatic system problem that is very much at the heart of the whole problem. If you can drain these toxins away, you can help all these other symptoms that ME patients associate. And once the system works, I've got patients who've just had my treatment, nothing else, and I've gone from very sick to completely better without any mitochondrial support, without any talking therapy at all. And that is because they've been lucky enough to drain off all the toxins and everything starts working again. Most patients aren't that lucky. They need other things as well.
Right. You know, I mean, it's interesting because you can find lots of case reports and even some actual research on specific individual methods that have been completely curative for individuals with chronic fatigue syndrome. So there's research, for example, showing that just focusing on the gut as the cause of CFS and doing a gut healing protocol can completely cure it. There's people focused specifically on the mitochondria who can completely cure it in a portion of people with that.
In those patients, they will have just that problem going on.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get that sorted out, then there's less stress on the autonomics, less stress on the hypothalamus, and then the body will kickstart. Now, I was asked one of the questions, you know, if anybody's gone through a PhD process, when you actually go, you have a few hours of examination by two examiners, and they drill you on everything about your PhD. And I still remember one of the questions said, can patients get better without any treatment at all? And I've seen cases that patients reportedly get better without any treatment. And those are the cases where they're looked after, they're in a good environment, where there's no stress, there's no strain, they've got a good diet, and bit by bit, their hypothalamus starts working again.
Right.
And bit by bit, the sympathetic nervous system starts working. And if they're lucky enough to have that situation, eventually everything will start working naturally, and they'll get better without any treatment at all.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that fact, along with what I was saying, there's people focused on the mitochondria or the gut, or, you know, as Asha Gupta and the lightning process are very focused on psychological stress and trauma and doing meditation and stuff like that. And they, you know, I've talked to some of these people and they kind of disregard a lot of the nutritional or lifestyle interventions. And some of them just they say it's all about the psychological things. And sometimes some subset of people will get better just from meditating and thinking positive thoughts and so on. And some portion will get better from the gut and other different protocols. What this suggests to me is that there seems to be an allostatic load factor going on, which is just total body stress load from all of these different factors will cause all sorts of different dysfunctions in a vicious circle. And then, you know, you could potentially just address one thing and it could be completely curative, but it suggests to me that maybe addressing multiple of these prongs is
I think that's the key is, we've got in the UK, you know, the nice guidelines that have been for years and years and years telling people that graded exercise program and cognitive behavioral therapy is the way forward. Well, the NICE are starting to rethink now. And there's a meeting I've been invited to attend next month in the UK, where we're going to start looking at maybe rewrite the NICE are going to rewrite the rule books in a way. Excellent. And look into that. And one thing I'm going to say at this meeting, I'm going to say exactly what you've just said. Yeah, if all of us who are helping patients with ME got together and we just had forget about one bullet cure.
Yeah.
Forget about that. You know, we spend so much money. There were so much hope on rituximab just recently. The studies done. And I spoke to, in the last ICFS meeting, I spoke to Myalgic who developed this, you know, about rituximab. This was a drug that they thought was the cure for ME. Mm-hmm. It helped some cancer patients and some people with serious autoimmune diseases. It helped them with their chronic fatigue. And that there was a subset probably of people that it basically wipes out the B cells, which are half your immune cells, and it starts over again. And that's in the nutshell. And they were pinning their hope on that this was a cure. And a lot of organizations around the world are saying, yes, we've got it. We've got rituximab. Rituximab has many side effects because of the nature of what it does. You know, you're susceptible to so many different infections. And one of the side effects actually is death. It can actually kill you. But if you're dying of cancer, you don't start thinking about that. And this was a drug that they were trying on. And Myalgic said to me when I met them in Florida last year, we didn't know when, we had no idea when, whether this, that they said to me, they didn't know whether this rituximab was a cure. They weren't telling people it was a cure. They didn't know which group it actually helped. They knew it helped some patients. And this is the same thing with all these drugs you see. There's going to be some patients who respond to some drug.
Mm-hmm.
But there's not one drug that responds, that helps all patients. And then you've got to think seriously about the side effects of the drugs.
Mm-hmm.
And if the side effects can be really severe, then you'll have patients getting worse by taking these drugs. And this is very careful. I'm not against drugs. Drugs are very important in certain symptoms, and they found that certain drugs help in ME, and certain supplements, lots of supplements help ME, but some patients don't respond well to even supplementation. You've got to be careful of what supplements you give. So I do appreciate what Sarah Miles talks about, and I do appreciate that, and I have seen patients improve with her treatments, but sometimes it's a combination of my treatment and her treatment that helps the best for these patients.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you said what you said, that we need to stop looking for this one magic bullet. Yeah. You know, I think there's a lot of people out there that are very ego-driven about kind of their thing needing to be the one thing that cures everybody.
I've learned that from years. It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
It's never going to be one treatment. But I believe that my treatment is a very essential part for most of the ME patients that we see.
Yeah, and I believe that. And, you know, there's an interesting report that I read. I think it was from Court Johnson of Health Rising, where he kind of did a review of all, you know, kind of survey data from all these different, I think it was 2,200 people with chronic fatigue syndrome, of all these different treatments that they tried, everything from graded exercise therapy and CBT, kind of that standard treatment, to the Perrin Technique, to just massage and physical therapy, to chiropractic and all sorts of other techniques. And what you see with all of that is that each technique seems to cure a portion of people and then make a portion of people worse and then not affect a portion of people. And there are different proportions in each category for each method. Your treatment fared very well relative to a lot of the others. But I think it's interesting that, I think that data tells me that it's not going to be one thing that fixes everyone.
It's not going to be one thing, and there's different practitioners that do different things as well. Mm-hmm. And this is the trouble when you've got a tailor-made treatment that I've developed. It's a lot to do with the skill of the practitioner as well.
Yeah.
And you've got to have a skillful practitioner who's been trained properly to do it. Otherwise, it could make people much worse. The book gives an idea behind it, but basically, with some people can use some of the ideas in the book to help themselves, but it is difficult to. I spend my life now going around the world training up practitioners, and hopefully within time there'll be other practitioners to learn how to train up others, so we can deal with all the millions of sufferers around the world. Yeah. But it's not just my treatment. I've never said that. All I tell my patients is we help 90% of our patients. We help.
Yeah.
And there's some we don't. And of those patients we help, we reckon, we did an audit that showed 15% get completely better with just our treatment.
Yeah.
But there's 85% who need other things as well on top of our treatment. And that's why I tell them straight away when they first come. So there's no illusions. Anybody says they've got the cure all, leave well alone.
Yeah.
That is what I say.
Yeah. I'm glad you explained that. That it's going to be, for most people, it's going to need a multi-pronged approach to fix this. And I think your work is key in that. So with that in mind, for people listening, how can they start doing the Perrin Technique? I mean, there's a lot of listeners who are in the United States, a lot of people in Australia and Canada and various places in Europe other than the UK.
Well, I've trained practitioners in New York. There's 10 of them in New York. There's one in California. There's a couple in New England. But the rest of America, and I suppose it's difficult. It doesn't work well because it's a long treatment, and it doesn't always work well with the insurance companies in America.
And you have to come in fairly regularly.
Regularly, and that's
a couple times a month, or
so it's usually once a week for the first 12 weeks, and then we space out the treatment if they go well. There can be changes to that, but that's usually, and it can be some severe cases can be treatment for well over a year.
Wow.
But the thing is that what we do know is that most patients would improve within the year. I've trained people all over. I was just in Russia recently. I've been in Sicily. I'm going to South Africa. I've been there before, but I'm going again in June. So, and Australia, I will go eventually. It's just a matter of getting over there. We're at the moment just embarking on a new research project. We've done the diagnostic study. We're doing a treatment study, and this was just last week. I've been invited by a hospital in the local area here in England to actually start off a new research project into treatment, which will show our treatment versus usual practice, and we'll see how well it goes. And hopefully after that, there'll be more hospitals around the world. I'll be able to train up doctors and physical therapists and chiropractors and osteopathic physicians that do hands-on to treat.
Yeah, I think, my hope is that, with your recent research that was published in the British Medical Journal and all the media exposure from that, I hope that your work, which I think is really pioneering and is amazing stuff, I hope it will become more widespread, and hopefully in the next few years you'll have an army of Perrin Technique certified practitioners, all over the United States and every country around the world.
There's a lot more work than just in chronic fatigue, because of this neurolymphatic system. They're now looking at other diseases like Alzheimer's, like Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, MS, possibly motor neuron diseases. All these diseases may be that, using part of the treatment, using my techniques, could help a lot of these. We are doing a bit of work in our clinic on patients other than just chronic fatigue, and having some very interesting results. But I'm not going to talk about that because we haven't done the research yet. And without research and without studies, we can't sort of say too much.
Yeah, well, I'll express my opinions personally. I think with the logic and the physiological mechanisms behind everything you're talking about, it only makes sense that your work and your methods would benefit pretty much every neurodegenerative disease.
Yeah.
So, finally, where can people read more about your work and maybe learn how they can find a Perrin?
It's online. You just key in the Perrin Technique. My book's available on Amazon, Amazon Kindle, and they can look up the BMJ Open, and it's on there as well. And then there's it's all. I'm open about everything I've done, and it's all there online. And you'll find that I haven't helped everybody. And there'll always be the ones that think I'm a snake oil peddler and that I'm talking.
Yeah, on that point, hopefully people are smart enough to realize that there's always some very small portion of people that writes negative things about everyone, including me, I know 150 people in the online health space who have their own businesses. There's always some 2%, 3% of people that will go write negative stuff. So hopefully people are smart enough and sophisticated enough to realize
if they read the work, most people say when they've read my book, and we're working on book 2 with all the science now to back up what I've said in the book 1. And it's taking time because there's a lot of science to back it up now.
Yeah.
But we're working on book 2, and that will come out sometime next year, hopefully. But the book 1's available on all the main outlets. And most patients, when they've actually heard my work, and maybe when they've just heard this interview now, will say it makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
They all say it makes sense.
Yes.
Science is nothing but organized common sense. That's a famous quote.
Yeah.
And that's.
That was my reaction when I read your work. And I also want to just rehash how impressive I think it is that you predicted this amazing, 2017 discovery that was this barn burner discovery of this amazing thing. And here you are not only knowing about it for over 20 years, but actually practically using that knowledge to actually help people. So, I think your work is pioneering, and it's really been an honor to have you on the show. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Avi. It's been an honor to be on, and good luck with all your work as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, and good luck to you. And we're going to put a link to your research and a link to your book, and thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure, and I hope to do this again.
As they say in the States, happy holidays.
You too. Take care.
Bye-bye for now.